Today, we're going to dive into the incredible story of a substance that, well, it started in a Swiss lab during World War II and somehow went on to define an entire generation. It sparked a cultural revolution, and then, poof, it basically vanished from legitimate science for decades. This is the wild, complex journey of LSD. And you really have to start with the words of the man who discovered it, Albert Hofmann. I mean, listen to that. I felt newborn. That's not just a chemist talking about a compound. That's someone describing a profound personal transformation. It's about seeing the world for the very first time. And that feeling really sets the stage for everything that follows. So, let's set the scene. It's 1943. War is just tearing Europe apart. But in the quiet, neutral labs of Sandoz in Switzerland, a chemist named Albert Hofmann is just doing his job. He wasn't trying to change the world. He was just trying to find a cure for migraines. And here's the thing. This discovery was a complete accident. Or, as Hofmann himself liked to call it, it was serendipity. See, ever since he was a kid, he'd had this deep, mystical connection to nature, this feeling that there was more to the world than meets the eye. And then one day in the lab, he accidentally absorbs a tiny, tiny amount of a compound he's working on. 3 days later, being the careful scientist he was, he thinks, okay, what just happened? And decides to deliberately test a minuscule dose on himself to find out. That first planned experiment, it was terrifying. He described being pulled into a totally foreign existence, a complete break from the reality he knew. But after hours of this incredibly intense journey, he didn't just go back to normal. No, he felt like he had come back to a new life, seeing everything with this incredible sense of wonder. Just like he said, he felt newborn. So what was this stuff? It was lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD for short. It's an unbelievably potent compound that comes from ergot, which is a fungus that grows on rye. And what's really interesting is that similar compounds have been in the plant kingdom for thousands of years. Heck, our own brains have chemicals that are pretty closely related. Now, this is a really important distinction. Hofmann and the other early users, they were quick to say this stuff didn't really cause hallucinations, seeing pink elephants or things that weren't there. Instead, what it did was transform your perception of reality itself. A wooden chair wasn't just a chair anymore, it was filled with this profound chairness. The world you already knew was suddenly seen in a completely new and often beautiful light.
Okay, so back at Sandoz, Hoffman's bosses realized they were sitting on something remarkable. They started sending out samples of this strange new compound to researchers all over the world, and it didn't take long for it to show immense promise as a tool for psychiatry.
And one of the most important hubs for this research was in, of all places, a rundown, demoralized mental hospital on the Canadian prairies. I mean, just picture it. A place described as being filled with constant shrieking and human suffering. A truly awful environment. And this is where the story takes a turn. The researchers there had some pretty wild, ambitious goals. First, they thought, hey, maybe this stuff can create a temporary psychosis. Maybe we can finally understand what our schizophrenic patients are going through. Second, they figured that by taking it themselves, they could gain real empathy for their patients. And third, they started using it to treat severe alcoholism, a condition that back then was seen as basically incurable. And the guy in charge, Dr. Humphrey Osmond, he laid down this really critical ethical rule. If you're going to work with this substance, you have to take it yourself first. He felt it was almost criminal to give something this powerful to a patient without understanding what it felt like. And that approach, it put his team in Saskatchewan miles ahead of everybody else. All right, so the story doesn't stay in the hospital for long. Pretty soon, it expanded beyond the clinic. Two very different but equally influential people would start championing LSD not just as a medicine, but as a key to unlocking spiritual and intellectual insights. And talk about an odd couple. On one hand, you've got Aldous Huxley, the famous British author of Brave New World, a total intellectual giant. And on the other, you have Captain Al Hubbard, a charismatic, mysterious, and super wealthy ex-bootlegger who became convinced his mission was to turn on the world's most powerful people to, save humanity. So Huxley, after his own experience with LSD, which was guided by Dr. Osmond, by the way, wrote his famous essay, The Doors of Perception. And his whole point was this: our normal, everyday consciousness, it's not the only game in town. He believed that if we could access these other states of mind, the way an artist or a mystic sees the world, it could help all of us become better, less self-centered people. So for about 15 years, all this research on LSD was happening quietly, carefully, in clinics and intellectual circles. But then, in the early 1960s, everything changed. The whole thing was about to escape the lab and just explode into a full-blown cultural phenomenon. And the person right at the center of this storm, a guy named Timothy Leary. He was a brilliant, super charismatic psychologist at Harvard, but he had a very, very different and much louder idea of what these substances were for. And you really can't overstate how different his approach was. The early researchers, Osmond and Hofmann, they were cautious, they were clinical. Their goal was to heal individuals and understand the mind. Leary, he was a populist evangelist. His goal wasn't just to heal a few people, it was to turn on all of society and kickstart a cultural revolution. This was his famous mantra. Leary's whole philosophy was that the only way to get real insight, to break free from the way society tells you to think, was to go out of your mind, to step outside the rigid, everyday way we all process the world. Well, Leary's approach definitely got a ton of attention, but it ultimately backfired. Big time. The media went into a frenzy, LSD became the symbol of the youth counterculture and protests against the Vietnam War, and a massive moral panic swept the country. By 1968, the government banned it completely, and decades of really promising scientific research just slammed to a halt. But even with the research shut down, a really crucial piece of knowledge survived all that chaos. You could argue it's the most important lesson from that entire era, and it was something that had been quietly figured out long before the media circus even started. If you go back and look at Captain Al Hubbard's work, you see he wasn't just handing people LSD. No, he developed this incredibly careful, structured system. It started with detailed preparation. Then he created a safe, comfy setting, had a trusted guide present, used music to help the person go on an inner journey. And, this is key, he provided support for integration and follow-up afterwards. It was a complete therapeutic package. And this, right here, this is the single most important lesson from that whole era. Hubbard, Osmond, Huxley, all those early pioneers, they understood that the drug itself was only one piece of the puzzle. The kind of experience you had was determined by two key things: set and setting. Set is what you bring to it, your mindset, your intentions, who you are. And setting is the environment, the room you're in, the people you're with. That was the great lesson. And in the end, the most profound insight for so many people wasn't about escaping to some other magical world. As one of the early participants put it, the journey often leads you to a really simple but powerful realization. Paradise isn't somewhere else. It's right here, right now. You just learned to see the wonder in the world that's been around you all along. Which, of course, brings us to today. After decades spent in the shadows, scientific research into psychedelics is quietly starting up again. So we're left with this huge question. After this insane history from scientific promise to cultural panic to decades of suppression, what is the rightful place for a substance this powerful in our world?